Great. So then I'm very happy to begin this conversation with the editors of the three journals that are traditionally said to be the most important for science communication research. This conversation is recorded for a seminar that is being held in Sweden on September 28th. And this is jointly organized by the Swedish Research Council, Linköping University, and Public and Science VA, where I work myself. And we hope to be able here today to increase our understanding about what this research field is about, some of the hurdles are, and hopefully how an increased research activity might be stimulated. Before we start, I just would like to present our participants here today. And we're actually sitting in three different time zones here. So first I would like to say good morning to Susanna Priest, who is Professor Emeritus and Editor-in-Chief of the US-based journal Science Communication. Good morning.
Good morning, thank you.
Would you care to introduce yourself with a few sentences?
Sure. So, as you noted, I'm the Journal of Science I'm the editor of the journal Science Communication. Yes, it is early here. And the full name of the journal, I think we hardly ever use, but it's important. It's it has a subtitle, so the obligatory colon in between: Science Communication, Linking Theory and Practice. Because that's kind of what we do. So I could tell you a lot about me, or a little, but let me just say that I'm mostly retired from teaching. I now live in Oregon, if people want to think about where that might be on their map. And my PhD is actually in communication, but I also have degrees in anthropology and sociology, and I've taught all over the country. Pretty much. So that's probably my minute and a half.
Yeah, thank you so much. So then we say good evening to Professor Hans-Peter Peters, who is Editor-in-Chief of the journal Public Understanding of Science. And you're welcome if you would like to introduce yourself as well with a couple of sentences.
Yeah. So I'm, since a little more than a year, I'm the editor of Public Understanding of Science. And I'm based in Germany. And originally I wanted to become a science writer in Germany. So I studied physics and social science, went to the research center Jülich as a PhD student with the intention to find a job as science journalist afterwards. But I got involved in research and remained there. In 2004, I was appointed adjunct professor for science journalism at the Free University of Berlin, but my main job remained in Jülich. So I spent almost 40 years as social scientist at the National Research Center that was founded as a nuclear research center in the 1950s, and in the 1980s began to phase out of its nuclear activities. Yet I've been working in a hard science environment with only a few colleagues from social science. And that gave me perhaps a slightly different view on science communication than that of those who spend most of their time in a social science department of a university. Okay.
Thank you very much and welcome. And then lastly, I guess we say good afternoon or perhaps good evening to Emma Weitkamp from the University of the West of England, who is the editor-in-chief of JCOM, Journal of Science Communication.
Well, thank you very much. So yes, I'm editor-in-chief of JCOM, the Journal of Science Communication, which is the youngest of the three journals, and I've been the editor-in-chief for about 6 years now. The rest of the time, I'm an associate professor at the University of the West of England, where I initially set up the Masters in Science Communication that we run there. But unlike my two colleagues, my background is in practice. So I spent the first 10 years of my career working as a science communicator, first in medical journalism and then subsequently in public relations, and then moved back into academia after that experience. So slightly different trajectory.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to the discussion here today. And to start off, research in science communication has overlaps with many different research topics. And we see that the researchers from Sweden who publish in your journals are generally situated in many different other research areas, such as education or sociology or media and communication studies, just to name a few. But we see also in other countries that research is a bit more institutionalized, for example, in your department, Emma. And I wonder, in your opinion, could or should science communication research be considered an independent research field in its own? What do you say, Emma?
I think it meets most of the criteria to be a research field on its own. I think if you look at a lot of the criteria that are used to consider a research field, it tends to be things like having recognized scholars, having scholarly networks, having degree programs, postgraduate programs, etc. And I think we meet all of those criteria, certainly. I think the area that's perhaps questionable is the disciplinary focus, because as a field, and I think you just mentioned that, we do tend to come from a really broad range of theoretical disciplinary backgrounds. And I think as a journal editor, that's actually quite challenging, because from that perspective, we're receiving publications that cross science and technology studies, linguistics, sociology, anthropology, and so bringing in a lot of different disciplinary backgrounds. So if we are definitely a discipline, it's a very interdisciplinary discipline. I think I'll hand over to my colleagues on that front.
Thank you so much. Susanna, do you agree with Emma's point of view?
Mostly, but not 100%. So I think it depends a lot on the institutional setting that you're talking about. So if you have to have a sort of core academic discipline. I think there are exceptions, but I think that where science communication is really integrated into a particular social science, social or behavioral science discipline, then even if it's just one person, they have colleagues, they have meetings, they think about curriculum. One person cannot make something like a PhD program or even a master's program. So at many universities might only have one academic who does science communication. There are also practical things about the university. How do you get funding? How do you get promoted? And if you have one or even two or three people all on their own, I don't think those processes, they're not designed for that. So there are probably there are at least two places in the United States that they have enough faculty that they could change the name of their department from whatever it is to the Department of Science Communication. But I think only two would be able to pull that off. So the research is going to do what it's going to do. And as long as people publish, the university is not going to care too much. But politically, and if truth be told, socially, I think that you need to have a core of people. And then going to have a core of people, or even one person, where you're going to put them. They most commonly in the US, almost always, they end up in communication studies. But one more sentence, communication studies is the newest of the social sciences. So some areas within the United States, and certainly some areas around the world, do not have well-developed research programs in communication. So there you might think, and again, I'm thinking about the political structure of university as much as I am the actual research. You're going to put them in sociology, you're going to put them in physics. I would rather put them in sociology because what we do in our research usually draws from the methods of social science or psychology. We actually probably, if we look at outside fields that we draw from in the US, I think we should do more sociology, but probably the most common is psychology, if not communication studies itself.
I see. Thank you very much. Very interesting. Hans-Peter, what's your point of view in relation to what we heard from Susanna and Emma?
It's difficult to add something new on what has already been said. In my opinion, the question whether we are an independent research field has no clear answer. I mean, certainly the field is not independent. There are some specific moral theories or frameworks that researchers in our field, so I use the term our field, frequently referred to, such as the contrast between public understanding and public engagement, or between dissemination and dialogue, or the medialization of science. But in general, the research in our field draws heavily from general theories of mass communication, psychology, and social studies of science, for example. And it overlaps, as you have already said, with political communication, health communication, environmental communication, risk communication, and science education, for example. So our field gains its identity more from the subject of its studies than from the genuine set of theories and methods. With respect to the institutionalization of science communication, there is a mixed picture. In particular in the United States, there have been early roots in programs and departments for science journalism deriving from mass communication. In Britain, I suppose the public understanding of science was closer linked to philosophy and history of science, and nowadays to the science, technology, and society approach. I think there is certainly, as I think Susanna has said, a core of the field of science communication. We know the university departments and the name of the researchers that we associate with that core. But there is also a large periphery of departments and researchers who remain firmly rooted in their disciplines, mass communication, psychology, sociology, or linguistics, for example, but still do research, excellent research on science communication, but also on other subjects. If I look at the affiliations of the authors of submissions to public understanding of science, I didn't count this, but I would guess that the majority of the institutes and departments our authors are affiliated with do not specifically carry a reference to science communication in their names. Personally, I'm very happy to think of the field of science communication as an interdisciplinary field. Although rhetorically, in my editorials, I tend to address our readers as colleagues in our field, thinking about the core and thus implicitly claiming some degree of identity and personally showing my identification with that field.
Thank you so much. I think there were a lot of interesting points that was raised here. At this seminar in Sweden, there are several different types of actors who participate, such as researchers, obviously, but also research funders, heads of departments, and communication professionals. And for those at this seminar who would like to see an increased research activity in science communication research in Sweden, I wonder what advice you would give to these persons. What would have sort of the most impact, or what needs to be done? What do you say, Susanna, if you go first?
You need to, well, I'm finishing some of what I already started off on by saying that you need to make sure that people are, the academics and their students, that's what I mean by the people, our colleagues, are situated in a place that is going to nourish them, right? So those of us who have been in universities for a long time you know, one thing I was told when I got my PhD was you think you're done, but you're actually just starting. So it's kind of like a license to start. And if universities don't give resources and moral support and political support to the people who are working in this area or any area, we all hear about academic politics, then they will not thrive. So resources are really important. I hate to focus on money, but whether you're establishing new researchers, assistant professors who are trying to build research programs, often building them on top of a dissertation, but a dissertation is just a dissertation. You need to make incentives available. If you're taking somebody out mid-career, an associate professor, and you want them to turn into a science communication specialist, well, you need to give them an incentive to put down their past activities, put down what they were doing before, and take up something new. So this is not just a matter of money, but it's a matter of taking maybe a course away from a person who wants to compete for a fellowship. There needs to be a fellowship, so money is relevant. But you want that person to be able to take a semester or a year off, not as a sabbatical where they work on whatever they're working on individually in terms of projects, but maybe a program that encourages people to take 6 months or 3 months or even a year and go to another university and study with people where there is already an established science communication academic program. So even if I'm a sociologist interested in science communication, I probably don't really know these theories and ideas that Hans started talking about that are unique to us as a field. I've never heard of the deficit model. Public engagement, what's that? I mean, I know what the words mean. So people need to add that in. So if you already had universities that were offering PhDs where you could focus on science communication, this would not be such a big issue. But I think in trying to create that focus within the existing structures, you honestly have to incentivize it. You have to make it possible. And again, I don't mean just money, but money is involved because people can't afford to take a year off work after, you know, they're 45 years old, or even if they're 35 years old or 25 years old. People can't afford to take a year off work to sort of figure out what's going on in this newest social science discipline, if it is a discipline. I agree that's got both sides to it. So I'll stop there. I'm sure other people will have a lot of additional thoughts.
Thank you very much. I realize that money and resources, of course, is a crucial part of the picture. Emma, you work at the Science Communication Department in Bristol, and UK is often lifted as an example where you have sort of a structure in several of the British universities with Science Communication Departments. Which is your take on this question?
I would completely agree that funding is absolutely crucial. So although we have an established department, I sit in a science faculty, so I sit along. I mean, I have social science colleagues in the university, but I physically sit in a science faculty. And my observation of the UK funding system is that science communication frequently falls between research councils. So funding is really tricky for us, and it's even more tricky from the point of view of PhD studentships. So the hardest thing for me is to get money to train young researchers. It's slightly easier to get money for postdoctoral researchers than it is the very beginning research is going to be made worse by leaving the European Union, no doubt, as well, from our perspective, because a lot of our postgraduate funding has come through that mechanism. So I think funding is absolutely critical. The other constituency that you mentioned that I thought I might just briefly pick up is the communications professional staff. So the people who support public engagement and so forth. And my perspective on that is that they often are very focused on scientists, because in the UK, that's where the big push has been. And the social scientists are perhaps less pushy about getting their research out there as well. So I think the other area where the field could do with support is in thinking about how support staff, communications professionals could actually help us to tell our story. We research it, but it doesn't mean that we're good storytellers. So I think that's another area that would benefit from ultimately funding, because people are money in that sense.
Thank you very much, Hans-Peter. I'm going to let you into the discussion again. What would be your perspective on the question of, how to stimulate research activity?
Well, actually, I have a different kind of message. So the audience of my message is not in the first place science research funders, but those who are responsible for the practice of science communication and who do programs on science communication. So the research managers, for example, but also the organizations that fund actual science communication activities. In the past few years, I've tried to sell 3 messages that are sometimes perceived as being against the mainstream emphasis on public engagement, but this is not my intention. Rather, I think that one should be realistic about the potential of engagement and realize that science communication has other functions too that deserve to be supported institutionally. So this is about research, but it's mainly it's about practice of science communication. So my first proposition, or my first message is that while I do see the relevance of caring about trust in science and the relationship of science and the public, trust is a necessary means, not a goal in itself. Some denounce all dissemination of science communication according science communication as dissemination as according to the deficit model. Susanna has mentioned that term, and some denounce, and I think it is possible and actually widespread practice to provide scientific information without assuming that the public is ignorant and deficient. So in my eyes, the provision of reliable scientific knowledge remains a core function of science communication, obvious in these times of Corona crisis. So I don't think that there is no dissemination or no information about scientific knowledge, but I think it is not as strongly institutionally supported by science communication programs as, for example, the public engagement exercises and public engagement programs. The second message I have is regarding trust. Personally, I find it a little perverse to conceptualize trust in science as the outcome of good science communication rather than of good science. All papers we receive at PUS on trust implicitly assume that the performance of science is good and only the way it is communicated needs to be improved. What we need to do is to understand the expectations of the public towards science and then publicly negotiate about these expectations. And my final message I want to get across, many implementations of public engagement trivialize the ideas of participation of lay people inherent in the original idea of public engagement. So these programs differ in the means, but not in the goals of former information campaigns. So it's more or less public relations for science. We need to worry more about the quality of public engagement, and quality cannot be reduced to impact and not to the amount of fun people have. We also need to avoid illusions of participants about their actual contributions and influence. And we need to avoid illusions about the transformative impact of public engagement ourselves. These are my 3 messages I want to get across. And thank you for giving me the chance of doing this.
Thank you for providing them to us. So really insightful responses from all of you, and it would be really nice to hang on to each and every one of these aspects and discuss more. But this actually ends the formal and first part of this discussion here. But we will discuss a few more questions that will be available separately for those who are interested. But at this far, I would like to say thank you very much for now. And then to start off this bonus session, this seminar naturally focuses on the situation in Sweden for science communication research, but it will look at the somewhat bigger international picture. It's clear that there is a difference in research output between different countries. And for example, we see a strong Anglo-American dominance. And I would just like to ask you, in your opinion, what would be the main reasons behind these differences? Would you like to start, Hans-Peter?
Yeah, I can. I mean, the United States is a large country with an extremely strong research system. It's leading in most fields of science. I mean, it's a little challenge now, but more or less for the last decades, it was a leader in most fields, and this includes also science communication. One, because science, social science was also strong in United States. Secondly, because of the strength of the science in United States, the demand for science communication and the demand for legitimizing science was particularly strong, I suppose. So I personally have profited a lot from the American model. I mean, I've met, when I was a young researcher, I've met American colleagues, and they were very generous in sharing knowledge. And actually, if I haven't met them, I probably not sit here as the editor of Public Understanding of Science. So they gave me a model of what one can do, which kind of research is possible, and so on. So this is the first thing. So really gratitude to the United States for being a model for many other countries, and Britain, of course, too. Then the second thing I could say is that we have a dominance of the United States and of English-speaking countries in generally that is related on the international level, that is related to advantage regarding the language of communication, of scholarly communication. And I think this leads to some underestimation of work in non-English speaking countries. So I have several research results or several authors in mind that I think have very interesting ideas and contributions to make regarding the theory of science journalism, co-production of expertise. There is a philosopher called Helmut Spinner who very early, I think earlier than in Anglo-Saxon countries, thought about the contributions of lay people to the production of expertise, experiments with participation, medialization of science. Okay, the later contributions are more visible on the international level. But I think this is not true for Germany only, but also for France, for Spain, and so on. There is a lot of things that are really interesting, which are not come to the attention of the international audience, which is a kind of sad, but I mean, we all know there is no other way of having lingua franca, English, as an international communication language.
I see, thank you. So Susanna, as an American, with the gratitude that Hans-Peter talked about, Do you agree? Do you have the same sort of image of the reasons behind this pattern?
More or less. I think Hans Peters mentioned most of the main elements. I just want to reinforce the importance of English. You know, sometimes people who don't speak English say, why do we, honestly, I hear this a lot from Asian scholars, because just as it is more difficult for us to learn Korean, it is more difficult for them to learn English. So sometimes they get to know me, they will say things like, well, you know, I don't know why I have to publish in English, but I do. Well, it wasn't our idea. It just because the Anglo-American world is dominating science generally. It is in fact, what is the word? A colonial influence there, that English is spoken all over the world. So it's not without its own politics. But as I think Hans Peter implied, we can't just wave a magic wand and decide English is not going to be it. And we're suddenly going to do everything in Portuguese or whatever. Random language popped into my head. So that is a challenge. It gives Anglo-American scholars a sort of a leg up, right? They have a advantage in the game. The other thing about the United States, though, that we haven't discussed yet, and I visited many universities in Europe and a few in Asia and one in Africa. So, but I don't really know the extent to which other countries have what we have in terms of the university system. The universities, the state-funded universities, which are separate from private universities, of course, the state-funded universities in the United States are mostly divided between the traditional range of university departments with the traditional range of missions, goals, and what we call the land grant universities. Now, today it's really hard. You look at the college catalog, you would not tell the difference. And people usually go to the university that they like, or that their parents went to, or that is nearest by, and maybe don't so much even know that they're going to a land grant university or not. But the land grant universities have, in addition to the traditional university mission, a mission in terms of outreach and in terms of upgrading research knowledge, originally for agriculture, but as time went by, in all areas, they have more, the land grants have more of a traditional mission for outreach and sort of uplifting people who need science information to do their work better, such as in agriculture, but also, of course, in many other fields, engineering, medicine, these are all applied fields. So, for example, I'm trying to pick a simple example because we have 50 states and everyone is different. But in most states, there will be a University of Oklahoma or a University of Rhode Island, right? That is the traditional state-funded university, often the most prestigious. And then there will be another university that is called Rhode Island State or Oklahoma State University. Those are just, again, two states that popped into my head. No states always fit this model, but the land grant universities, if you look at where the really successful graduate and research programs are in the United States. Interestingly, the two I would pick out, and I won't pick them out today, but if you want to know, somebody can send me an email. But the two most prestigious right now and for many years have been at universities where there's a slightly different model, and the traditional university mission is in fact integrated with the land grant mission. And I think that helps because you need theory and practice, right, in this field. So I think for science communication particularly, it's that land grant tradition that has helped to nurture it. Even though the universities that are leading the pack right now are ones where land grant activities and the traditional mission is combined. One more point that I think is really important is this question of applied research. And to some extent, this follows the land grant state university split. So in some departments, in some fields, applied research is considered very much second class. It's not as academic as the real academic work. Philosophers are usually not applied, although there are applied philosophers. But typically philosophy is not an applied field. Typically theoretical physics is not an applied field. Believe it or not, it's not. It's something that has a theoretical solution and people focus on the theory and advancing the theory, and we do that too. But because part of our mission is to improve how science is communicated to help society, sometimes that's a tension. And it's just related because I think the tradition of the land grants tends to nurture applied research more than the traditions of the university as opposed to the state universities of land grants. Every state's different. I once went to I'll just finish this off with a little anecdote. I once went to a job interview and I had a very good friend and colleague on the faculty, and he was encouraging me to do this, and we went through the, academic job interviews are enormously elaborate. You have to meet people all over campus and all this stuff. And I had, I think, lunch with the department head, and I knew I wasn't going to get the job because she asked me, do you really like doing all of this applied work? And until that moment, I had never thought of my work as being particularly applied to the average communication professional. My work is usually, off in the stratosphere. It's all a relative concept, but there is this tension between applied work and purely academic work that is something to be aware of when people are thinking about, well, where do I put a new program? And it's part of what I meant when I said they have to be supportive of moving in that direction. When you hire one person, say you're the science communication person, it's not going to work very well if their colleagues think about their work as someone not having the status of real academic work. That is a real problem. It usually doesn't manifest itself in the places that have good science communication programs, right? But it's something to think about if you think about looking at a map and saying, okay, I have X number of euros, right? And where am I going to put my science communication program? It has to be a place that wants it. So anyway.
Absolutely, and I think this tension between applied and or more academic work is really interesting and something that we should perhaps book a new appointment to discuss in more detail. But when it comes to this sort of Anglo-American dominance, both of you talked about the aspect that is, of course, as a native English speaker, you have an advantage when it comes to writing, for example, papers. But this would go for all, I guess, scientific areas, as English, as also you pointed out, I think, Hans-Peter, is, the official language for the absolute majority of all scientific journals in any field. So Emma, do you think that this, is it extra sort of pertinent or with what is for science communication, or is it more sensitive? Is science communication research more sensitive to advantages of native English speakers, so to say?
I wouldn't say it is. I mean, maybe certain very technical sciences have less of a problem because they have so much specialist language anyway. But I don't think it's particularly a problem. My first degree is in chemistry. At the time, I was required to take as a second language German or Russian because the historic chemical literature is in German and Russian. And you can't engage with it unless you have some language skills. The alternative was math, by the way, and I opted for math. So I'm sorry, I speak no German or Russian. But I think that the point is that languages have, disciplines have a history, and they have a history where they started, and that is often linguistically bound. I think that the science communication field has that history amongst the communication sciences and sociology, which does have fairly deep roots in the Anglo-Saxon world, but also has deep roots in Germany. And I think it's quite interesting that that I guess those authors have become translated. I think that's ultimately the issue. You don't have to go and learn German to read. Probably even if you do learn German, you can't read Habermas. But you don't have to do that because the authors become translated. And I think that that's probably true for pretty much all the major thinkers that didn't originally write in English. Certainly all the ones that I deal with, I wouldn't have to go and look at the original, and in most cases couldn't even entertain going and looking at the original language editions because they've been translated. And I think what's happened, and it's happened across disciplines, is it's become essential that you read English in order to further on your career in academia. Even if you don't choose to publish, you have to at least read English. Some scholars will prefer to publish in their native language, which I think is perfectly understandable. It's much easier to express yourself in your native language, but that does limit who reads you. And so with JCOM, we have tried to overcome that by offering some publication in other languages with translation. So the journal office will arrange translation. We can't do Asian languages though. So the place where there is perhaps the biggest challenge is in those languages. As Susanna's pointed out, it's much harder to learn English if you're a native Chinese speaker. But we can't offer a translation because we don't have anybody who speaks Chinese. So that's a problem. And what I would say I've also noticed is I don't get very many papers in other languages. I get a few, usually in Portuguese, occasionally in Spanish, both of which are at least languages I can make some stab at. But you know, it's not a big issue because people actually want their paper published in English in their English. So even if we're offering to translate it, they actually want it to be their writing, I think, in most cases. And I certainly wouldn't say that, you know, our translations are going to be perfect, because that's not the way, it just doesn't work that way. You're not a specialist in the field doing a translation, and there is something about being a specialist in the field and writing in that language. So I think it is simply the dominance of English that has presented that problem for many people. I think, you know, there are other factors around where disciplines develop that contribute to that, but the kind of historic, over the last 50 years, dominance of English within research generally, I think has brought about a lot of that challenge.
Sure, thank you. Another aspect of dominance, we have some time left, so I think there's time for at least one more question. But just speaking of dominance, research in science communication has been said to focus more dominantly on specific research fields as an area of study. So for example, medical sciences or natural sciences is the topic, of much more empirical studies than research in, for example, the humanities or the social sciences. And or is this in line with your experiences? And if so, is there a problem with this? I mean, does it make the results sort of context dependent? Emma, you go ahead and continue.
I think that if I look at the combination of research and practice in this response, so by and large in the UK, if you say science communication, you mean natural science communication. If you wish to be inclusive, you say research communication or natural and social science communication, which excludes arts and humanities anyway. So in the UK, it's very much a kind of structured, traditional disciplinary boundaries in that sense. So if I were to say to somebody, oh, well, I research science communication, the assumption would be it's broadly in the areas of physics, chemistry, biology, maybe broadening out into environmental science, which then encompasses some of that messy social science side of things. So I think from a research perspective, that's probably a linguistic issue, at least in the UK. And I think that's probably true in the US and Australia as well. In terms of practice, it's quite clear that for many of us working in the field, the focus was initially, again, on natural sciences. In the UK, the drive comes from the need to connect people with the natural sciences, rather than necessarily thinking about the social sciences. And I think there was some sort of assumption that because you're studying social processes, social science is just easier to understand than physics, and therefore we don't have to work at it. So the kind of the push from practice to understand what's going on in science communication was towards the natural sciences. And it's only relatively recently that the social sciences, and by recently I mean sort of 10 years, something like that, have really started to think about the fact that maybe they also need to think about research communication, or what does it mean to do public engagement? How do we tell people about our research? How do we engage people in our research? Because it's not quite the same to think about engaging people with your research as it is about having research subjects. So that sort of move towards public participation and public involvement in research, citizen science, whatever, however you want to frame that, has kind of come from health, come from science, and kind of moved into the social sciences, which were studying it, but weren't necessarily thinking about doing it, say, 15 years ago in the UK. So I think that's kind of the difference, that the social sciences were to some extent felt perhaps a bit excluded by the terminology, and were also not perhaps driving it from a practice perspective. I'll hand over to somebody else there.
Yeah. Hans-Peter, in Germany, I think you talk about Wissenschaftskommunikation, with Wissenschaft being a more neutral word perhaps than science, as it, I think, as in the Swedish translation, would include sort of, do you still, from a German perspective, agree with what Emma just said about the situation in Britain?
I would say a German researcher, a German science communication researcher, Wissenschaftskommunikationsforscher, would mostly include social sciences in the thinking, in the meaning of the term. And actually many works, even very early works, included social science and humanities in, for example, content analysis of science content of newspapers or so. So this has to do exactly with the meaning of the German translation of the English science, which is Wissenschaft, and which means all academic disciplines. So there is a difference. On the other hand, in Germany too, there is more research and more concern about the communication of the natural sciences. And this has first to do with a transfer of American and British approaches to the field. So we really imported perspectives from the Anglo-Saxon world 2 times, and that meant that we focused on natural sciences in much of the research. And the second thing is that what already has been mentioned, that the problem of science communication is different for the natural sciences and for the social sciences and humanities. And I mean, as in the Anglo-Saxon world, German newspapers have a section Science, Wissenschaft, and that includes Naturwissenschaft, not social science. Social science is in other sections of the newspapers. And that demonstrates that the interface between the disciplines and the public is different. We once did a survey of biomedical researchers in 5 different countries, and then we started to overgeneralize our findings, saying the scientists do that and think that and that. Then a wise old German sociologist came and said, well, be careful, could be different. Yeah, you just studied biomedical researchers. And then we did in Germany, we did a survey of German researchers from 16 different disciplines, including social sciences and humanities. And there were huge differences between the disciplines. Yeah, so for example, in the social sciences, the scientific knowledge is considered to be part of everyday knowledge more than natural science knowledge is considered part of everyday knowledge. So while natural science knowledge is considered special knowledge, this is less the case for social science knowledge and psychology and so on. Yeah. And so the interfaces are quite different. So there is a distinction between natural sciences, hard sciences, and social sciences, humanities. But there is also distinctions between different kinds of natural sciences. So geography is a little different from physics and so on. Medicine is a little different. Mathematics is very different. But also in the social science humanities field, we have a more professional dealing with humanities than with social science. So the humanities have their own section in newspapers, for example, feuilleton, culture, while this is not true for social sciences. So extremely interesting differences between the interfaces of disciplines and public.
Truly. We have only a few minutes left, but I would really like to give also Susanna the opportunity to give her views on this last question, if it's possible to keep it.
Everybody else has said a lot of things that sort of used up the subject matter, but a couple of points. One is that humanities, as it's used in the American academic context, is entirely separate from science. Social science is kind of in a gray area. Well, you people think you're scientific. We don't, but we understand that you think you're scientific. But the humanities is in its own world. So usually you have within a university, you might have a college of science. In one of those land-grant universities, you might have a college of agricultural science all on its own. But humanities would be enfolded in like College of Arts and Science, or trying to think of other names, but they are not usually in the same college as the sciences. They're thought of as being very different. In fact, if I get a paper that talks about communicating the humanities, I don't quite know what to do with it, because it doesn't connect to the literature that we already, it's not that it's a bad paper or something I don't want to hear about, but it doesn't connect to our literature very easily because it's a whole different thing. That's the first thing. The second thing, and I think this is certainly true in the UK as well as the United States and Canada. I don't know, I think it's probably true worldwide, but one of the motivations for promoting science communication is because it's perceived that there's a controversy. GM food controversy, nuclear power controversy. This becomes very difficult because the scientific view is not always consistent with the political view, and the political view in some cases might be correct. I don't think people are wrong if they have concerns about either of those things. I'm just picking two examples, GM food or nuclear power. So we've been evolved, as it were, to help respond to controversies like this. And we have to be very careful because we don't want to use public engagement as a way to mold public opinion to what we think it is. At the same time, we have this hope that if you bring people on two sides of this controversy together, they might find some common ground. In fact, there's research on that. They don't find common ground. They do learn to understand each other's point of view better. So where am I going with this? There's no controversy about how English literature teaches Shakespeare, right? I mean, there may be different approaches, but it's not something that people are going to be on the street fighting about. So there's not the same societal motivation to address those issues that might arise in the humanities. Again, the social sciences is somewhere in between. Some social scientists are Marxists. That might become very controversial if it were publicized, right? But in some countries, in the US included. But generally speaking, we aren't having people march in the streets arguing over the fine points of the social sciences and humanities. So they have not become flashpoints for demanding intervention to damp down. I'm not sure we should always damp them down. I think that's part of the good side of public engagement. We don't necessarily want these controversies to just go away. We want people to appreciate the variety of points of view, including scientists. Scientists get educated by science communication. They're sometimes kind of not ready for it. But that's part of the deficit model. They think the whole thing is getting their perspective into other people, but they should get other people's perspectives into their thinking as well. And as you pointed out, we're just about exactly out of time, so I'll stop there.
That's right. Thank you so much to all of you three for really insightful responses and anecdotes and perspectives to all of these questions that we have discussed here today. I have learned a lot, and I'm sure that it will be of interest to a lot of people at this seminar, and also hopefully viewers in other contexts. So I will leave you now to your mornings and evenings and afternoons, and say sincerely thank you to all of you for your engagement and commitment here today.
Thanks to all of you for organizing this. It's been interesting for me, and I'm sure Hans-Peter and Emma as well.
Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
So have a good day and good evening. And yeah, I hope to see you again soon at some place and time, and Corona is over. Yeah. Travel is a problem nowadays. And seeing on video is not the same, right?
No.
Really not. No. Now it's. I also have I have the TV screen here, but the camera is somewhere here. So there are so many different. I don't think you. For you, I don't look you in your eye when I look in your eyes, so to say, which also makes some sort of psychological twist to.
And if you think you're looking the other people, if you think you're looking at the other person in the eye, you really aren't.
Yes.
No.
You're not. Like sometimes momentarily, I think, I'm looking in your eye, but I'm not. Sorry to interrupt. It is.
No, just an observation. I think this is some sort of, it's tiring when sitting in Zoom meetings for long times, that you sort of socially interact with each other in a incorrect way or not. Well, anyway, thank you again. You're welcome to leave the room, but you're also welcome to stay.